You're listening to the Missionary Perspective Podcast with veteran missionaries Eric Johnson and Joshua Mead. We're glad you could join us. We trust this podcast will be both a blessing and a challenge as we relate topics in world evangelism from a missionary perspective. Now, here's Josh and Eric.
Welcome to the Missionary Perspective Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Johnson, and today is very special for me. I finally get to sit down with someone I've wanted to interview probably since the very first day we started the podcast. Dr. J.B. Godfrey is with me today. He and his wife, Linda, have served with BIMI for almost 50 years in various roles, and we're going to talk about that today, dedicating their lives to missions and ministry. And in this episode, we're going to explore the many different hats that Dr. J.B. has worn over the years. And more than anything, I want those who maybe have not heard the story of Brother Godfrey to know it and to get to know him better. And we're also going to have two other podcasts that are going to be podcasts, or basically going to be the time that Dr. Godfrey is going to speak to some missionaries tomorrow here at our church and just share his heart with missionaries, and we're going to provide those as well. But today we're going to be looking at the man behind the mission and Dr. Godfrey and the incredible ways that God has worked through him, his wife, and his family over the years. But it's a pleasure to have you. Thank you for being on the podcast today.
It's good to be here.
Now, it's so exciting. We get to learn about you today and your family, but we want to learn kind of a sequential order.
Sure.
So we'll start from the beginning, and I believe you've been with BIMI, started over 50 years ago, off and on, but pretty close to 50 years of service.
We joined BIMI in 1973.
Wow.
So it's been over 50 years. However, there was a period of time after 20 years on the field that we got chased out because of fighting from our country.
Right.
And I pastored my own Sunday church, and I taught missions at Ambassador Baptist College. And I never dreamed I would do that. And then I never dreamed I would leave there when I did it because I loved it. But then we were asked to pray about coming back with BIMI.
Right.
And my wife and I, for 7 months, struggled a little bit with that. It wasn't that we didn't want to do it.
Yeah.
We just needed to know that God was in it. So I actually went on a trip. I had been asked to come back at BIMI and be our Far East field director. Now that's Mongolia, China, Korea, Japan.
Right.
And I told her, I said, you've lost your mind. So we were struggling, but I went on a trip with Dr. Clayton Shumpert, who at that time headed up our clay ministry, helping church missionaries build churches and repair buildings. And I went on a trip with him, hard-working trip. I worked hard on Okinawa, praying. God had shown me, helped me. What do you want me to do? And I came back from that trip more confused than ever.
Wow. And
the next week after that, I think it was the next week or two, we had revival in my church with evangelist Tom Farrell.
Mm-hmm.
And Brother Farrell was my good friend. He walked in the office and said, Brother Godfrey, I'm surprised you're still here. And he had no idea what I was going through.
Wow.
And that week, we had people get saved. God worked in our church. And the next Sunday, I did the hardest thing I ever did in my life. That was stand up before my people and resign.
Wow. Well, that's about chapter 10 of this book right now. We're going to go back to chapter 1.
Go back.
We jumped ahead there. So let's find out a little bit about you, where you grew up, and how you came to know the Lord. In fact, just a little inside baseball here. We were just downstairs in our seminary class, and Brother Godfrey shared his testimony with the seminarians. And so tell us a little bit about where you grew up and how you came to know the Lord. All
right. My wife, Linda, and I both grew up in the upstate of South Carolina. Mm-hmm. So Spartanburg, Greenville area, not that far from Bob Jones University and Tabernacle Baptist Church and a lot of other good churches there. But we went to a church. We didn't go on a regular basis. My dad had left. My grandparents reared me. We were poor people. I won't describe how poor, but I know you hear people tell about walking 10 miles through the sun. We didn't do that, but it was a long way out of our house to the outhouse.
Sure.
And I was 14 before we lived in the house of that inside plumbing. Wow. But in that time, I went to church. I wasn't spiritually minded or whatever, but I went and I heard the gospel and I heard it and I heard it. And the Holy Spirit was working on me. And one Sunday, I just went forward and told those people I need to be saved. I was 12 years old.
Wow.
And went to Sunday school, never really discipled much, but at 16, I had an uncle who died, and it wasn't nothing to do with that funeral, but I went that day and I sat there in that quiet before it started. And God is working on my heart about being a preacher of the gospel.
Right.
Almost, I would say, even from then, a missionary. And it scared me out of my wits. There's no way I thought I could do that. I'm too bashful. I'm too poor. In fact, when the next Sunday, I went forward and surrendered to preach the gospel publicly. And I wasn't going to do that. I went to church that day. Said, I'm not going to go to that altar and get up and embarrass myself. But I stood it till I couldn't wait. And I went forward and told those people God called me to preach. I was 16 years old.
Wow.
I can say that I've never had a doubt about that in all these 58 years I've been a preacher. And I went to my pastor and said, I don't know anything about it, but I will, God's called me to preach. He said, we're having a revival. We're going to have some cottage prayer meetings. Would you speak at one of them? And I did. And then I preached in the church. And thinking back on that, I wonder, why in the world would he let me preach? It was a good sized church.
You just sensed it.
But I did. And then I preached any prisons, nursing homes. But anyway, that Sunday I surrendered way before I was married. Linda's mother and father were there that day.
Wow.
And I found out later that her daddy told her mama, honey, that little fella never will make a preacher. Because no one would have looked at me, and Linda was very bashful and shy. No one would have looked at us and said, that's somebody God's going to use. And we didn't see it that way either. We just knew God wanted us to serve. Well, I went in the Marine Corps straight out of high school as a young preacher. I learned a lot about working with people in the Marine Corps. Linda and I wrote back and forth. We never really dated in the typical way, but we wrote and we got out of the Corps. We got married, and then God let us move off to Bible college. I don't know what I would have done before then. I was poor. I would have had to work so much. I don't know if I could have made it. But having gone in the Marines, the GI Bill paid for my college. And we went in that day, 1970, we moved over to Tennessee Temple University at Highland Park Baptist Church in the day when people were being saved, and we were running bus routes and mission emphasis. And we had surrendered anywhere you want us to go, God. But I had no idea where, or we didn't know. And I read a little article in a little Baptist paper printed in Lawrence, South Carolina. Pastor John Waters, who's been in heaven for years, at Faith Baptist Church in Lawrence. God used, Van Truax wrote it, just 4 or 5 lines that said something like this: there's a great need in the Sahara to reach Muslim people with the gospel. We missionaries and churches typically leapfrog over those countries. And God used that article in what I call, how do you know what God wants you to do? I have a burden everywhere I've ever heard of. When it's of God, it's a repeated burden that you can't get away from.
So you're in the military, you get out, you and your wife start going to Bible college and read this. So the Lord directs your heart to go reach Muslims in the desert, and you realize, well, speak a language that they know, I need to go learn.
And we did.
I need to go learn French, right?
We did. We learned French. We went to France a year and a half. 8 hours a day we studied French. And then we lived in a home with a French family for 6 months.
That's a great idea.
And we learned a lot of our French watching TV, kids programs on TV and the news. And then we took a ship from France straight down to Senegal, got off and moved to a city out in the desert, and not one neighbor we had spoke French. Now, it was a French-speaking country. The educated people spoke French, but village people, and we lived on the edge of a city. We rented an old house that was not even finished yet. We did a lot of the work ourselves, and we moved in that house, and I hired a young man who was a football player, a soccer player, you probably would say, but football player, who had no clue about how to teach anything. But I know how to study. I'm a linguist. I had studied linguistics, and I would study with him in the morning. And then I'd just go out and sit under the tree outside our house and talk to people as they came by and go to the market. And the Wolof people, the Senegalese people, are so talkative and friendly, and their greetings have to do with God. And every greeting was 15 minutes, and you can't live there and not talk about God.
Right.
And so we jumped in, and Linda likewise, And within 6 months, this sounds awful because we couldn't have done it in French, but within 6 months, I'd started my first Bible study that turned into a church.
Wow. So to get to Senegal, you started doing some survey trips. Now,
Yes.
A little over a year ago, my co-host Josh had the
Yes.
pleasure to go spend some of the last times he would ever meet with Brother Ron Bragg and Donna Bragg, and he got to hear some of the stories from the times there. But we would be doing a disservice if we didn't talk about Brother Bragg and you and some of the experiences that. And today you were recounting to my kids the story when you all decided you were going to start looking for some place to serve. You have to tell us. We've got plenty of time. We got to hear the story.
Well, Brother Bragg and I, there were 4 families of us in France ready to go to the field, and we were going to the country of the Niger, right out in the center of the Sahara, and they had a coup d'etat, and missionaries had to leave, and we could not get visas. So here we are in language school, ready to go, and we couldn't go where we thought we were going. And we got down a map, and we started praying, all of us, and Brother Bragg and I left our families in France, and he and I went down. And we were dumb as gourds, and we're wandering all over town, and we were in places we probably should not have been. But we decided we wanted to see the east side of the country in a town called Matam, which is not far from Timbuktu, which is over on the Mali side.
Right.
So we took an Air Senegal flight, got in the thing. I won't describe the airplane, but there was no stewardess or anything. And it would land, and they would roll out barrels of fuel and hand pump the fuel in to the airplane, but nobody ever said where we were at. So we landed once, twice, maybe 3 times. And Brother Bragg asked an African man on the plane, are we in Matam? Bragg didn't speak good French. The man may not have understood French. So he thought he said yes. So we got off the plane. Well, as soon as we got off the plane, left. We found out later, didn't come back there for a week. So nobody asked for a visa. It was just a little dirt runway out in the middle of nowhere. So we started walking into the town. We're passing out gospel tracts right and left, and got closer to the town. And I saw a Frenchman, and I walked over to him and said, "Sir, could we find a house to rent here in Matam?" And he looked at me strangely. He said, "Young man, I hate to tell you this, but you are not in Matam. This is Kaidi." Well, Brother Bragg and I, we had no clue what Kaidi was or where it was at. So not only were we in the wrong city, we were in the wrong country. We were in the Islamic,
the wrong turn.
we were in the Islamic Republic of Mauritania without a visa. We're supposed to be there. The police had gone around and took up all the gospel tracts we gave out. We ended up being hauled into the police, had to give our whole life story. And then we asked, could we get a taxi? They call them bush taxis to Matam, because we had to get there before that plane left to go back to Dakar. And so he said, yeah, walk down this road and follow that. It was so hot the camels wouldn't stand up. We had 1 bottle of water between us. So we followed his directions, but he didn't tell us the taxis were on the other side of the Senegal River. So we're walking down the river, found some fishermen in a dugout canoe, took us across, got in as a Peugeot station wagon, a French station wagon. 8 people have to pay their part to go to whatever city you want to go to. Got in it, and no really paved road, a dry riverbed. We're driving down. Bragg elbowed me and said, "Godfrey, look at this car. The speedometer was gone. Everything was gone in there except the oil light." And we went 100 kilometers without oil light off and got to that airport in time to get on the plane to fly back to Dakar, the capital city. So I don't tell, both of us were field directors, but we didn't tell that story very much.
Well, if you're listening to this and you want to be a missionary one day, it's probably going to be hard to top that survey trip. So if they can survive and flourish, I'm sure you will too, if not every part of your survey trip is planned out. Well, we were reflecting on Brother Bragg and Mr. Bragg and the years you had there. So I was going to camp there for a minute, and you shared, there's so many funny stories we heard, but why don't you talk a little bit about how you guys worked as a team. And you've talked over the years, and he did as well, how you had very different backgrounds and even personalities, but how it just gelled in the ministry.
When they first got there, my wife and I went first. We had 2 little children, so we were the first independent Baptist missionaries that we know of in Senegal. There were no Christians where we moved to. Couple of months later, the Braggs moved down. They lived in our home with us for a month. And then they moved about 70 miles north of us in the city of Saint Louis, Senegal, where Josh Mead is at now. And they started to work there. And we worked in 2 different cities, Jurbel, where we started, and then eventually in the city of Aluga. But then one point in time, Braggs came home on furlough and no one was in their city and work. And we came back from furlough and moved into their house. We lived in their house for a year. And they all thought I was Bragg's son because I had hair back then and I was a younger man and Bragg was a little bit bigger. So we teased each other, we picked on each other, but not just Brother Bragg and I, who became, I don't know how to describe it. When I preached after his funeral, I talked about David and Jonathan. God knit our souls together. And it's hard to describe how close, but it wasn't just Brother Bragg and I, it was Donna Bragg and my wife Linda and our kids. They had 5 kids eventually. We had 5 kids. And our kids grew up together, sang together there, ministered together with us. And it was just the biggest blessing to be in a place where you had like-minded people. And that was over 50 years ago. And we were sort of best friends for 50 years.
It's been so special to hear the stories about them. And you know, we've talked a lot about team missions. I've been able to have teammates. Brother Josh had teammates. And we were talking on a drive home up to my house recently about how we still think team missions is a great idea if it works the right situation. How, when you now at the mission, how do you encourage people to think about when it comes to team missions?
If they're new young missionaries, I tell them, if you can find someone that you can work with, even if it's 6 months or a year, but it might be longer than that, do it. Now, that's not possible in every case, but in many cases it is. And so why not learn from somebody who's been there? They can save you a lot of embarrassment. They can help you get started with the language. And again, Brother Bragg was a sailor and I'm a Marine. He went Bob Jones, I went Tennessee Temple. But he's from Western Missouri and I'm from South Carolina. But we had so much fun. One year, I probably shouldn't tell this on the podcast, but one year I was on the field and he was back on furlough and he wrote me a letter. Well, we had camels, sheep, and goats. We had the real Christmas story, nativity. And he wrote me a letter and said, JB, are you going to have the Christmas story this year? I said, I wrote him back. There were no phones. I wrote him back, said, Brother Bragg, we can't have it this year. The donkey's not here. So the next time he was there and we were in the States and I wrote Brother Bragg, I said, you're going to have the Christmas story this year? He said, we can't have it this year. The wise guy's not here.
You guys love ribbing each other. And it was fun to hear Josh's interview, how he recounted the same kind of glimmer in his eye when he thinks about you guys. And I think that's very special. We've encouraged missionaries, just like you did, if you can find that like-minded person that, you know, you see the same eye and philosophy and get together, it's always, you know, 2 heads are better than one. Now, looking back to your time in Senegal, I wanted you to kind of reflect on some of maybe the biggest challenges you faced with your family in the ministry and maybe personally as well. It could be physical, it could be mental, it could be emotional.
Yeah, it was, we enjoyed working there. The people were very friendly, even though they were all Muslim people, but their greetings had to do with God. It had a lot of benefits. It wasn't easy to win somebody to Christ. However, it was really easy to witness people. And there are a lot of things in their culture they identify with. They kill a ram every year in memory of God providing the ram for Abraham's son. Wow. Man, what a place to start with the gospel. And I use that. I probably use Genesis 22, that story, more than any other portion in the Bible. When I started with them, I learned that I always started in the Old Testament because they didn't really know who God was.
Right.
And that was true. So it had advantages. On the other hand, it was dusty, dirty, 110 degrees, could be 120. 10 months it didn't rain any. it had a couple of months, it rained hard and they planted their crops. But if you can imagine a new wife like mine living in a place like that, we closed the windows. We had wooden shutters and closed the doors, closed the windows. It was cooler closed up. Even then, when the wind blew off the Sahara, Linda could set the table, and before you could eat, you could write your name in the dust in the plate. But that's hard on a lady that likes to keep a clean house, and of course, homeschooling children, and there were no modern conveniences much. You had to go to the market. We didn't have big grocery stores. Now we ate better, because we ate fresh fruit and we had bananas and mangoes and vegetables and a lot of fish and so on. But it was everything you did took a lot of time.
One of the things Dr. Godfrey was explaining to the seminarians down below, that he learned French in language school, but then very quickly when he got to his field, he had to learn another language, which was Wolof. And over the years, he started developing not only to learn Wolof, but you started working on some translation.
Yes, not only that, my wife, and I have to brag on her because she deserves it, but back in those days, there were no computers.
Right.
We didn't have phones, let alone a computer. So I worked for years on a French Wolof French lexicon to help new missionaries coming in to have something to study. But all we had was a typewriter. I mean, an old clunker typewriter. So I would work on that. Linda typed it all up. And by the time she typed what I just did, I would have made 1,000 additions and changes. And she typed and never. But that really helped us learning the language. Because then I'm getting into where I knew the grammar better than the people did, and they appreciated that. The French attitude was then, let them learn French. We're not going to learn their language. Well, we started learning their language, which says to them, hey, I love you.
Wow, it does.
And not just me, but Linda and our kids, before long, we were speaking more Wolof really than we did French.
So obviously back in the 70s and 80s, you didn't have, internet, you didn't have computers. No. Didn't have that kind of entertainment. What kind of things did you do for fun as a family?
Okay, we watched some lizards do push-ups on the wall at night for entertainment. But we played games, okay? The kids, as they started in the school, we played Boggle and Scrabble and Uno and Monopoly, and we're big readers. So by the time our kids finished kindergarten, first grade, they could read. So all of us, there were 4 of us missionary families in the same area, not in the same city, but so we knew what books the other ones had. So when I came back on furlough, I would get in books that they didn't have, and we'd take them back and we swapped them around. So we read the Danny Oldest books and all the Patch the Pirate and 8B and stuff. Our kids grew up on that, and then when we did work with the Brights every Friday night, we got together and just had a family night, and we laughed and did things together.
It's exciting how a lot of times it's just the spirit and of the family being together and doing things that makes it fun. And
it does.
And one thing I can definitely say about the Godfreys is they're people who are, we say the cup is half full, not half empty. Very positive people. And I think you have to be a missionary for any length of time. And we've talked, probably won't have time for all the stories, but so many stories, you could look at a story and have the wrong perspective. You could be negative on it, but you also could see where the Lord is working. And we've been encouraged this week just by hearing some of those stories. Now, you were in Senegal for 16 years, and as you mentioned downstairs to the men, you're coming to the end of that. Oh, you didn't know it was the end of the time, but at that time you were finishing up the translation or helping out the translation of the New Testament Wolof. And you probably, we've been here 16 years, so I kind of can relate. Like, in some ways, you feel like you're just starting to pick up steam. You're starting to figure things out, and you're probably thinking about the next 10 years. And then what happens?
Well, then we were asked, Dr. Nonsis and Dan Truax, who was our director, wrote and called and said, would you pray about going to a different country, the country of Zaire, which is the old Belgian Congo? And we gave the proper answer, we'll pray about it, meaning no way in the world. It makes no sense. It's not logical. We speak French. We invested in Wolof. And honestly, God did lead us there, but it was much easier for me to make that switch than for Linda, because she says, as she says, ladies like their rut. You get used
to something.
Okay, we invested 16 years in 2 languages.
Yeah.
And a lot of people. And Donna Bragg and my wife Linda won more Muslim ladies to the Lord than any place I've ever been around.
Wow.
And they loved them and they worked with them. So the thought of uprooting a family and moving thousands of miles away to a totally, it was as opposite. Senegal's flat, desert, barren, Muslim, dirty, dusty. The Congo is rains and it's humid and it's mountains and it's jungle and everything wild you can think about, from crocodiles to every kind of snake almost in the world. And here I'm taking this wife who's, when we went back to live there, she'd never been there.
Wow.
I had gone on a trip with a bunch of young people, and God used that trip. See, they all felt God calling them there. And BIMI felt it's not wise to send these young green missionaries to a place they don't speak the language, they've never lived in Africa. And God used that trip to get a hold of my heart. They needed somebody there who could jump into the work, but also be there when they arrived to help them get used to that. And so I'd gone on that trip, came back, and we broke up shop. We never went back to Senegal.
Wow. So that transition was a pretty great one, a pretty large one to adjust to. At that time, I believe 2 of your children stayed home, and it was your younger 3 that went with you onto the field.
Yeah.
And he mentioned to our churches yesterday that they were 100 kilometers from electricity, 2 kilometers from just the water you were going to use. How did your wife and kids adjust that first 6 months to a year to that?
You know, they did. People,
Sounds
I don't
amazing.
know if they think I'm lying, but they did so great. There were a lot of kids. The one thing that grows well in Africa is kids, children. There were a lot of children, and our kids made friends, and the African pastor and the people in our church. We had a church where we could have 1,000 people in our church on Sunday. And there were many churches in that, say, a 50-mile area along this huge river. And it was very open to the gospel. And that was hard on Linda because for 9 months, she did not have a stove. And a lot of cooking, you wrap fish or food in banana leaves and put salt and some spices, wrap it up, put it in the ashes of the fire. That, or we had a little, like a tin can that somebody had made a little lid on it that you ran wicks up from the kerosene and you lit it, but it never got really hot. And she cooked that way for 9 months without a stove of any kind, because of fighting. As soon as we got there, fighting started. 10,000 foreigners fled. The Belgians, the French, a lot of Americans left. Those Christians had been praying for 30 years for missionaries to come back. We just got there. I told Linda and the kids, said, why don't y'all go back to America? And when it settles down, I'll let you. And they said, if God wants you here, God wants us here. And they chose to stay with me. But for 6 months, our moms and dads and 2 kids and BIMI, they didn't know we were alive. Now, we were okay, but we had no way
communicating
of letting them know. And our African Christians would walk 5 miles, 10 miles, 20 miles with a handful of hand of bananas or pineapple or eggs or a back leg off an antelope or some pigeons or whatever. They took care of us, which is, it's very humbling.
Yeah.
When you're in a place where you're used to being the one helping everybody else. And here we are, totally dependent really on them. And we fell in love with them and them us. And it's still got a lot of friends there.
You told some funny stories about your son, probably even trying to do his part by going to catch some rats in the jungles.
Yeah, no, we had house rats we didn't eat. But
I know.
Jungle rats, the pastor's son was named Bakebwood, and they were just like 4 or 5 years old, Robert and Bakebwood. So they'd go out there, the windows in the morning, we were just below the equator, so we had 12 hours of daylight year round.
Mm.
And they would go out in the morning, they would go down in the jungle, and there were trails where the rats ran down through there, and they put those traps. So we'd send the girls out, they were homeschooled, go find Robert. Well, they knew exactly Robert Buckett, where they were roasting jungle rat for breakfast.
Well, I've so many stories, and I wish I recorded all of them all this weekend. But we were talking a little bit about just even that time where you eventually did send your wife and kids home ahead, a little bit ahead from the Congo, when you realized it was time to go, and you had to take a pretty treacherous trip back. I guess it was to the embassy.
Well, we didn't leave our village. The U.S. Embassy, by then I had a ham radio.
Right.
Because the fighting had died down, and Brother Bragg came, our container finally came. I had a ham radio. The U.S. Embassy called me, and they said, have your wife and children in this little town called Ethiopia, had a dirt landing strip that had grass on it knee high. You had to scare the goats and the sheep off of the runway. Single engine aircraft flew in to take them out, but then there was a sick man that needed to be flown to a hospital. So by the time they put him in, Linda and the 3 kids got in, there was no space for any of their suitcases. So they leave, and I'm standing there with 6 suitcases with their homeschooling stuff, plus our clothes and everything. And once they left, I had no way of knowing. Did they make it out all right? They didn't know what happened to me, where I was at. I went and hid out in an American Baptist hospital, stayed at home with a doctor. And then the military was threatened if we didn't pay their salaries to come to the hospital and kill everybody and loot the hospital. And I ended up, and that was some time later, I ended up evacuated out with those doctors and nurses. And the next thing the family knew about me, I was in New York City in March with short sleeve jungle shirt and about to freeze. And I called home and said, meet me at the airport with a coat. But Linda and the kids, when they were evacuated out, they ended up in Brazzaville, Congo, on the other side of the river, and met up with Tom and Melissa Vineyard, our young missionaries that worked with us, and they were having to leave.
Wow.
And so God worked it out so Linda and the 3 little kids didn't have to come back by themselves, but they traveled with Tom and Melissa. And Tom's dad's church bought the tickets. God just worked miracles, but we got back in the States. I lost 40 pounds through that episode. Linda and Benita had been exposed to TB, and they were on medicine for a year. So I was ready for another change. I wasn't ready for another change.
Well, that's one of the things I want to talk about is that, many times, and we've talked about this in different podcasts, that, God has us in places for a certain time. Some missionaries, it's 30, 40, 50 years, and some people it's 10, 15, 20 years, 3 years. And so speak to us a little bit, especially those who maybe they were missionaries for a while and they had to make a transition, and maybe they've had difficulty in their minds understanding that. How was that transition for you to then stay in the States and I believe become a pastor after that?
Yeah, I became pastor of my own sitting church. I was a kid preacher under the founding pastor.
Okay.
But when I got back, I didn't know they didn't have a pastor. And the last thing I ever thought I would do would be a pastor in the United States of America.
So living in
I'm an African. And the people saw God in it. Well, I met Dr. Don Sisk again at a big international conference for world evangelism in Raleigh, North Carolina. And he introduced me to several people. One of them was Dr. Ron Comfort, who had started Ambassador Baptist College, who was looking for someone to teach missions, who had been a missionary and understood and been a church planter. And Dr. Sisk put me in touch with him. So instead of going back to Africa, which physically at that point I just wasn't able. So I took a church with a growing church with a Christian school and started teaching missions 2 days a week. So I've been a little bit crazy all my life. But I stepped into a church that I knew them, they knew me. I built on what I knew the original pastor stood for. And from the first day, it was evident God was in it. The church grew. God was calling our folk into missions. We were giving more to missions than the whole church budget was when I first came.
Wow.
Every year it went up. And I wasn't saying a lot about it. I just brought in missionaries and Dr. John Halsey and Dr. Sisk and others, Clayton Shumpert, and they preached. And then I was teaching probably 140, 150 students a year in missions. And I never thought I would teach. That was why. But once I did it, I taught the lessons in the missions classes, but I illustrated the points of the lesson with not people that lived 250 years ago. Thank God for those men.
Yeah.
But hey, look, today there's just as much exciting, maybe more so exciting things going on as then, because we have more means to get things done.
Absolutely.
And I taught my classes, but I illustrated it with modern day stories like I've been sharing, and the students loved it. And I thought, God's put me here to influence young people in my church and in the college.
Well, that's the neat thing too, is because he says they're modern day stories, but for us listening stories from 50 years ago, we wouldn't even consider it as modern day. But that's the neat thing, is that Dr. Godfrey, started back in the 70s, but the Lord wasn't done with you. I mean, obviously you were still teaching missions, but he wanted you back more integral in missions. Yeah. And after a number of years of pastoring, that Dr. Sisk character just keeps coming back. Eventually you think you would have avoided that guy.
Yeah. 9 years I pastored. I loved every minute of it. Mm-hmm. People got saved. I mean, God was just blessing my church. And Dr. Sisk called me, Brother Godfrey, would you pray about coming back with BIMI and serving as our Far East field director? Well, Far East, that's China and Japan and Mongolia and Korea and Philippines. And I said, Doc, I love you, but there's something wrong with you. We're Africans. We speak French, Wolof, Kikongo, and some Arabic. You want me to go where? And then, okay, for 7 months, I'm pastoring. I can't talk to anybody. Linda and I are agonizing, praying. God, what do you want us to do? I can't bring it up because I don't know that God's in it. Right. And so I went on a trip to Japan, a working trip. Came back more confused than ever. And then right after that, evangelist Tom Farrell came in to preach a revival in my church. And the first words out of his mouth to me, he came to pray with me, Brother Godfrey, I'm surprised you're still here. And he had no idea how we were praying, God, please just show us what to do. And then God used that revival. But one thing he did was the next Sunday I resigned my church, which tore my heart out.
So how long were you the Southeast or the Asian director?
10 years.
10 years.
We went many, many, many times. We spent all summer every year out. I'd ask Dr. Sisk, why would you ask me? I've never been there. I don't want to go there. Why? And he would say, Brother Godfrey, you and Linda, you love missionaries. You understand church planning. You understand their problems. They need somebody who can sit down beside them. And, I've told people for years, so I mean it was more important that Linda go than I go. Because sometimes those missionary wives, they're the ones who needed somebody. They knew where she lived. They knew she went through some rough times, and she can just sit down beside them and put her arm around them and listen. And so for 10 years, we visited. It took me 5 years to do it, but we visited, and we did field conferences every year. But we visited every family we had on the field in the Far East, which is spread out in a big area at their place, spent time with them. The kids think we're grandma and grandpa. And I never dreamed I would do that either. But again, I loved it. And I learned a lot about helping missionaries and dealing with missionaries by being out with them.
So if you're counting back at home, the different hats, we're talking about a Senegal, we're talking the Congo, we're talking about pastor, but we're also a professor. And then the Lord calls you to be a director. And then he has right now one more hat that you've been wearing for now a number of years as the Vice President of Baptist International Mission. When did that start?
That was 14 years ago. But let me just say, even in that, before then, as I was Far East director,
that's right.
I was asked, would you come out, Dr. Sisk again?
Different hat, different team.
Would you come out and teach at West Coast Baptist College?
It's all back to Dr. Sisk.
I cannot do that.
Got to get caller ID for him.
I cannot do that. So, but Dr. Martin Rasmussen would say, Brother Godfrey, where could you be around 1,000 young people that want to serve the Lord? And he was so right. And I went out there and I preached and taught. I taught missions, and I traveled all over the country and the world when I did it. But I've taught 10 years there.
Yeah.
And then I was asked, would you pray about serving alongside of Dr. David Snyder, who's my good friend. And he's the president of BIMI, and I'm vice president. And for 13 plus years now, he and I have worked together. It'd be hard to describe. He's the young guy and I'm the old man, but we just are good friends. We love each other. We watch each other's back. We plan, we pray for God to call more laborers. And so we're involved in everything that kind of goes on at BIMI, from Canada School in Richmond. We count BIMI, helping the directors and the missionaries get meetings. And so when I preach missions conferences, a lot of those brand new missionaries are in the meetings with us. And I've been doing that now. I've traveled. I would be afraid to know how many miles, millions of miles Linda and I have traveled. And then in the course of being Far East director and now vice president, we get asked by missionaries all over the world. We come out and spend time with them and preach for them. And we've ended up in literally all over the world, which we don't even like to travel. We don't hate it.
You fool us, right?
We love what we do, but we don't. But we've been to New Zealand and Australia and Papua New Guinea and Fiji and the Philippines, from one end to the other, and Japan and Taiwan and Hong Kong and Mongolia, and of course back to Africa, to Uganda and South Africa and Ivory Coast. And we get asked to come out again for the same reason. The missionaries know we love them, and we get to go, we get to go soloing with them. So now in these years, 24 years, Linda and I have seen people trust Christ on 6 different continents, not countries, continents.
Right.
The only place that we haven't won somebody to the Lord's in Antarctica. And we're saving that for Brother Johnson.
Saving that. Well, I can attest to the joy it was to have them yesterday. Right where we're sitting now in our first church plant, we had our Faith Promise Commitment Sunday, and I'm pleased to say that the Lord increased the faith of the church. We're praying that it would be something they complete this year. But afterwards, we had an international dinner. Now, if you heard all those countries represented, you can understand that Brother Godfrey likes to eat exotic foods. You can't just want hamburgers and French fries and be a missionary. And so one of the fun plates, and we had different, it wasn't too big a variety. Dominicans don't like to stretch too far out, but there was a gentleman from our church who's actually from Colombia who wanted to do something exotic for the international dinner, and he had some cow tongue, and Dr. Godfrey made a beeline for that, got a whole tongue, enjoyed it. Even our kids, they were like, I wasn't sure about that, but Brother Godfrey was enjoying that. And
the tongue is so much easier to eat than the chicken. Because the chicken, you have to chew it off the bone. The tongue is
there's no bone, right? It's ready to go. So we enjoyed that here in the morning time. And then in the evening time, we got to go out to one of our sister churches, one of the churches we planted, and he preached. I was able to translate. We saw a number of people saved. And so that joy just to see after 50 plus years in missions, that's still there. And we're gonna end with one fun thing and one maybe more of a meditative thing. Okay. What's talking about food? What's maybe the most either exotic or interesting thing that you've eaten that you think would be very interesting for someone to hear?
Well, food we've eaten
everything,
okay, including balut and century egg and things like that. But I want to instead of food, I want to talk about drink.
Okay, there you go.
The best coffee in the world is from Indonesia.
Okay.
And if you buy it here, if you buy it in America, it costs $200 a pound.
Oh my!
But it grows on the trees. The civets, which is a raccoon-like animal, the civets eat the coffee beans. It goes through the system. It comes out on the other side.
Pure, huh?
And they gather that coffee beans, and they say it takes the acidity out of the coffee, and it's the smooth. It's the best coffee you've ever had in your life.
Unbelievable. That would be the most unique. So we'll have to check out that Indonesian coffee sometime. Well, the last question, and this is more for maybe prospective missionaries. I remember years ago, my favorite missions book of all time was called Missions to the Headhunter. And it was actually written by Frank Drown, who was a missionary with Jim Elliot and them in the forest. And we know the story of Jim Elliot and his friends. They were martyred, but Frank stayed in the jungle for 37 years. It's just a great story of just how the Lord worked. And I just happened to do an investigative research, and I found his number, and I called him up, and I just wanted to get a little bit of advice. He was very old at the time, and I asked him, I said, if you could give me as a future missionary just some advice. He said, love the Lord and love the people. And so in that kind of vein, what are some things that you would, when you meet prospective missionaries, you encourage them maybe in an overall sense what to be focusing on there in mission?
I've said this probably 1,000 times when I teach and when I preach and talk to young people. I know can you have a good missionary or a bad missionary? Yes, you can.
Sure.
A good missionary loves the Lord and is willing to go to that place that God's calling him and plant his family, himself or his family. Love those people. Stay there. Don't quit the first problem you have. I say this all the time, that when young missionaries go to the field, the first 6 months, they love everybody there. It's interested. They carry their babies on the back, everything else on their head. Oh, you're taking pictures. And everything's great the first 6 months. The next 6 months, you hate everybody there. They've lied to you. Yes. You've been robbed. You stole. Nothing's the way you think. No. And I tell them, stay.
Yeah.
Give it some time, and you'll find out, hey, they got their characteristics, but so do we. And you invest your life there, and people can tell if you love them or not. And if you're willing, and that's more difficult in certain countries, like Muslim countries, maybe in Catholic countries, or Japan, which is modern, but it's Shinto, and they have no idea about a personal loving God.
Right.
But you have to be willing to go there and just learn the language. And if you don't learn the language and the culture, you're probably better off to stay home.
Well, there's so much we could continue to talk about, and Lord willing, in the future, we'll have more podcasts. I also want to encourage those listeners today, be on the lookout. We're going to have a few more podcasts that are actually going to be the sessions that Dr. Godfrey is going to have with the missionaries, where I'm sitting with him right now. Tomorrow, we're going to have those sessions. But lastly, I also want to encourage you, if you'd like to hear more about BIMI, you can go to bimi.org. But what I do every morning before I get my coffee each day, while it's percolating, I turn on a 5-minute little podcast every day that Dr. Godfrey has through BIMI. It's called Moments in Missions. You can find it wherever podcasts are. You go to bimi.org, get a link, but you can find it every weekday. There's a new story about missions, whether it's a prayer letter or an interview or some insight that Dr. Godfrey has. And my family, it's so funny because I have it on so frequently that they told me this, Dr. Godfrey. They told me they when you were there telling stories, they would close their eyes and they thought, oh, this sounds like the podcast is going on right now. So we encourage our listeners to go to find that podcast, make it something that you can subscribe to and just get popping in your phone every day or going to your computer and then just hear what's going on all around the world. He has missionary letters literally all around the world in a week.
It's also on thousands of radio stations.
Thousands of radio stations too.
We're on 3 stations in Papua New Guinea.
Wow.
We're on Dr. Jack Trevor's station in San Jose, California. That's rebroadcast all over Australia and other places. It's a radio program. That's how it actually started, and then sort of morphed also into the podcast.
Well, we'll put a note in the show notes. You can find a link to it. Check it out every day, and I know you'll be encouraged by it. Thank you, Dr. Godfrey, for being with us today, and we're looking forward to more time with Dr. Godfrey in the future.